After 7 years of marriage, Major Ethan Carter threw his wife and child out into the teeth of a raging storm, all to make room for his wealthy mistress. He tossed a set of divorce papers at her, his voice dripping with scorn. "A leech like you is just holding me back." But Ethan could never have imagined that the woman he had just discarded would appear the very next morning at the gates of his military base. She wasn't a beggar, but a queen stepping out of a Maybach sedan. The moment the base's commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, greeted her with a deferential bow of his head, Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized his wife's true identity. She was not Cinderella, she was Eleanor Vance, the sole heiress to the Vance dynasty, one of the most powerful and storied families on the East Coast. And the cruelest revenge wasn't a jealous tirade, but forcing the traitor to his knees in regret, realizing he had just burned a priceless treasure with his own hands. The fate of the wretched husband would make you say 2 words: well-deserved. The night rain lashed against the city, threatening to drown everything in a cold, white sheet of water. The wind howled through the window frames, rattling the glass with dry, sharp clicks. But the coldness outside was nothing compared to the glacial frost that had settled over the elegant living room of Major Ethan Carter. The air, thick with the smell of stale liquor, was suffocating with the finality of a dying marriage. Eleanor Vance sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching her 3-year-old daughter, who slept fitfully in her arms. She looked at the man before her, not with the adoring love of 7 years past, but with the utter shock of seeing a stranger wearing her husband's face. Ethan stood there, his uniform jacket discarded, leaving him in a crisp white shirt that only amplified his cruel indifference. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the expensive watch on his wrist, his expression a mixture of impatience and disgust. The silence stretched taut like a fraying wire, finally snapped by his low, cutting voice. He bit off each word, devoid of any affection for the woman he had shared a bed with for years. His reason for kicking her out was delivered as casually as brushing lint off his shoulder. Ethan said she had become a burden, that her quiet, submissive nature was now just a useless liability, an obstacle on his wide-open path to success. He needed a wife who was more than a homemaker. He needed a launchpad to power, someone who could elevate him to the positions he craved. And that woman was certainly not Eleanor, the woman who had given up everything to be his shadow. Eleanor bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She wanted to scream, to ask him about the vows they had made, to remind him of the youth and the true identity she had sacrificed to build this family. But looking into his calculating, ambitious eyes, she knew words were useless. Ethan's betrayal wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to clear the way for another woman, a wealthy heiress, who could roll out the red carpet for his career. He wasn't just having an affair, he was performing a transfusion on his life, cutting away the part that was once closest to him. Before Eleanor could process it, Ethan roughly dragged a pre-packed suitcase from the corner and threw it into the middle of the room. The sound of the wheels clattering on the hardwood floor was so jarring it made the child in her arms startle and wail. Her daughter's cry tore through Eleanor's last shred of composure, but it also awakened her maternal instinct, forcing her to be strong. Ethan showed no pity at the sound of his own child's weeping. He merely frowned in annoyance and pointed a finger toward the door, an exorcist banishing a demon. He coldly ordered her to leave tonight, because she was arriving in the morning, and he didn't want any remnants of his failed marriage to offend his new lover's eyes. His cruelty peaked when he declared she was unworthy to stand beside a man like him, a man on the cusp of greatness. Eleanor stood up, holding her child tighter. For the first time that night, her gaze met his directly. It was not a look of pleading or weakness, but a piercing stare that saw straight into the dark abyss of his soul. Without a word, she silently picked up the suitcase and turned her back on the house that was once her home, now a tomb for her youth. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the boom echoing like a gavel's final strike, severing all ties. The sound, resonating through the storm, was more final than thunder, cutting off any path of return. The moment she stepped off the porch, the freezing rain lashed at her face, stinging like 1,000 tiny needles. Rainwater mixed with salty tears, trickling down the corners of her trembling lips. She took off her thin coat and wrapped it tightly around her daughter, trying to shield the small child from the fury of the storm. The frightened toddler burrowed deeper into her mother's chest, her whimpers swallowed by the downpour. Eleanor's feet felt like lead as she walked down the street, its asphalt surface slick with the jaundiced glow of streetlights. Each step was a knife twisting in her pride. She remembered the early days, when she had abandoned her life as the cherished daughter of a legendary family to marry a poor army officer, believing in the purity of his love. She had secretly used her own money to support him, to build his reputation piece by piece. And now that he had grown his wings, he cast her aside like a worn-out coat for a newer, more fashionable one. The rain grew heavier, and the wind whipped the trees into a frenzy, their branches bending as if about to snap. The image of a small woman carrying a child, stumbling through the vast, dark expanse, was one of utter desolation. No taxi stopped, no door opened. The entire world seemed to have turned its back on them on this fateful night. The cold seeped into her skin, into her very bones, but the chill in her heart was far more terrifying. It was the cold of despair, of shattered faith, of being utterly alone in a world where she thought she had found a safe harbor. Her feet, now swollen and numb, began to falter. She walked aimlessly until she reached a vacant lot at the end of the affluent neighborhood, a dumping ground for the residents' trash. The stench of rot and damp earth filled the air, a nauseating miasma. How ironic that the filthiest, most disgusting place was the only one that offered her refuge. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed next to a pile of junk. The suitcase fell over, its contents spilling onto the muddy ground. Eleanor held her child tight, her back against a grimy, moss-covered brick wall, her breath coming out in weak, white puffs. She tilted her face to the sky, letting the rain wash over her delicate features, now pale from cold and pain. In that moment of ultimate despair, with her dignity crushed and her body and soul broken, a dark flame of vengeance began to smolder in Eleanor's eyes. Here, in this garbage heap, shunned by the world, she realized a part of her had died. The meek, long-suffering woman of yesterday had perished in the storm. She looked at her daughter, now asleep from exhaustion in her arms. Her hand clenched into a fist, nails digging into her palm until they drew blood. She swore to herself that the tears of this night would be the last she ever shed for Ethan Carter. From the ashes of this marriage, she would rise again not merely to survive, but to reclaim everything he had stolen, to make him see the true value of what he had so callously thrown away like trash. Darkness enveloped mother and child, but deep within, a much larger storm was brewing, heralding a proud rebirth from the deepest mud pit of her life. In the ink-black night, where the drumming of rain on the tattered tin roofs of the slums created a miserable symphony, two brilliant beams of light suddenly sliced through the darkness, illuminating the mud-drenched vacant lot. It was the headlights of a black Maybach, gliding into the narrow alley like a colossal beast that had lost its way. The presence of such a luxury vehicle in this god-forsaken place was so incongruous that even the rain seemed to pause on its gleaming hood. The car stopped just a few feet from where Eleanor and her child lay. The whisper-quiet engine died, replaced by the howl of the wind through the broken windows of nearby derelict houses. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out before the driver could circle around with an umbrella. His expensive, handcrafted leather shoes stepped directly into a muddy puddle, but their owner seemed not to care. Julian Morgan stood there, his tall, imposing figure a bulwark against the wind. His custom-made charcoal gray suit bespoke the quiet authority of a corporate titan. But that composure lasted only a second, until his eyes fell upon the small, huddled form by the trash heap. Under the harsh glare of the headlights, Eleanor looked like a broken, discarded statue. Her long, dark hair, once silky, was now matted with rain, plastered to a face devoid of color. She clutched her child in a desperate, protective embrace, a mother bird with broken wings still trying to shield her young from the storm. Julian's heart seized. A pain, sharper and more violent than any hostile takeover he had ever weathered, shot through him. He rushed forward and knelt in the filth, heedless of the mud staining his fine suit. His hand trembled as it touched her shoulder. The cold from her body was like an electric shock. He gently turned her face toward him, brushing away the wet strands of hair. It was her. It was really her. Eleanor Vance, the muse of his college years. the girl whose radiant smile had made his heart skip a beat for 4 long years, though he had never dared to confess his feelings. The woman he had assumed was living a life of pampered bliss, now lying by the roadside, amidst reeking garbage, in the most wretched state imaginable. Sorrow swelled into a tidal wave of fury inside him, overwhelming all reason. He couldn't believe his eyes. His large hands quickly shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat and wrapped it around both mother and child. Then he lifted them both into his arms as if they weighed nothing. Eleanor had fainted from exhaustion, her head lolling against his solid chest, her breath as faint as a candle flame in the wind. Julian held her tight and strode quickly back to the car. His eyes darkened, concealing a barely suppressed rage. He ordered the driver to his private villa, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the experienced chauffeur shiver and ask no questions. The car sped through the night, leaving the cold, miserable trash heap and the painful past behind, a modern-day ark rescuing lost souls from the flood. In the warm, quiet sanctuary of the luxury car, Julian studied Eleanor's gaunt face in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. He took a warm cloth and gently wiped the streaks of mud from her cheeks. His fingers grazed the small scratches near her eyes, marks of hardship and time. He wondered how she had lived all these years. The man she had chosen, the one for whom she had rejected all others, what had he done to reduce this precious gem to such a state? Each question was a fresh stab of self-reproach. If only he had been braver back then, if only he hadn't stepped aside, perhaps she wouldn't have had to endure this humiliation tonight. When Eleanor awoke, the first sensation wasn't the bone-chilling cold or the drumming of rain, but a strange, enveloping softness. She blinked her heavy eyelids open to see a high ceiling with intricate crown molding. A soft, golden light emanated from a crystal chandelier that glittered like 1,000 tiny stars. She was in a massive bed, under a plush duvet that smelled of sunshine, a world away from the grimy mud. The room was perfectly silent, except for the gentle hum of a heater. A warm, elegant scent of sandalwood drifted through the air, erasing the foul memory of the dump. Panicked, she shot up, her first instinct to find her daughter. Seeing the little girl sleeping soundly beside her in clean, new pajamas, her heart finally dropped from her throat. Eleanor surveyed the unfamiliar room. Everything spoke of understated luxury, from the cream-colored velvet curtains to the vase of pristine white lilies of the valley on the dressing table. This wasn't a hospital, nor was it some cheap motel. The door opened softly, interrupting her chaotic thoughts. Julian entered, carrying a tray with a steaming bowl of oatmeal, its fragrant aroma of new rice and chives filling the room. He had changed out of his wet clothes into a comfortable beige turtleneck and slacks, looking more approachable and warm than his usual formidable self. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to stand still. The room suddenly felt small, crowded with the ghosts of their shared past. Eleanor was stunned. Her dry lips parted, but no words came out. She recognized him. How could she forget the brilliant class president, the classmate who had quietly helped her throughout college, the one who had sent a lavish, anonymous wedding gift? But to meet him again under these circumstances, kicked out by her husband, penniless, a complete wreck, while he was the master of this magnificent estate shame, made her want to disappear. She looked down, her hands clutching the duvet, trying to hide the trembling of her shoulders. She dreaded his pity, his scorn, the questions she had no courage to answer. But Julian didn't ask. He didn't look at her with scrutiny or cheap sympathy. He gently placed the tray on the nightstand and pulled up a chair, sitting just far enough away to not feel imposing, yet close enough for the warmth of his presence to be a comfort. He looked at her, his eyes deep and calm like an autumn lake, filled with sorrow but also with immense compassion and respect. His deep, warm voice broke the awkward silence. "You and your daughter are safe now. Don't worry about anything. Just rest. We can figure everything else out tomorrow." The short statement, with no prying questions or judgments, was like a sedative, soothing her frayed nerves. Eleanor looked up into his eyes and, in that instant, felt an inexplicable sense of trust. This man, who had appeared at her moment of deepest despair, was no coincidence. Fate had arranged for them to meet again, Not at a glamorous party, but at the nadir of her pain, so he could pull her from the mire. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside this room, the storm had ceased. Julian stood up, gently tucked the blanket around her daughter, and then turned to leave, giving her privacy. His shadow stretched long across the floor, steadfast and solitary. As the door closed, Eleanor placed a hand on her chest, where her heart, though faint, was beginning to beat with renewed life. She knew this was the longest night of her life, but it was also the end of her deluded past and the beginning of a new chapter where she would no longer have to fight alone. The grand living room of the Sunrise Villa was enveloped in an almost absolute silence, a world away from the dissipating storm outside the large plate-glass windows. Julian sat across from Eleanor, a polished black mahogany coffee table between them. On it sat 2 cups of steaming lotus tea, their delicate wisps of steam intertwining before vanishing into the air. Eleanor had changed into a soft, seafoam green silk lounge set. Her once-drenched hair was now dry, falling loosely over her slender shoulders. But her eyes, once as bright as the morning sun, were now hollow pits of despair and exhaustion. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure, as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Julian didn't press her. He quietly refilled her teacup, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving her haggard face. He understood that some wounds, if not lanced and allowed to drain, would fester and kill the soul from within. Finally, Eleanor's voice emerged, soft and trembling like a dry leaf crushed underfoot. She began to recount the story of a marriage she had thought was heaven, but which turned out to be a gilded hell. She spoke of the early days, when Ethan was a young, ambitious, but poor officer. She had hidden her identity as the pampered daughter of a prestigious family, content to live with him in a cramped military apartment, sweltering in the summer and freezing in the winter. She had used her private savings, secretly selling off precious family heirlooms to grease the wheels for his career, to secure him promotions that everyone else attributed to his supposed brilliance. A bitter smile twisted her lips as she told of the dinners she had cooked, waiting for him until the food grew cold, reheating it over and over, only to receive a text message saying he was busy, or worse, to smell the scent of another woman's perfume on his collar when he stumbled home at dawn. It began with simple neglect. Then he started criticizing her, calling her frumpy, complaining that she only knew her way around a kitchen and was of no use to the image of a rising star like himself. The constant criticism, like a steady drip of water, eroded her self-esteem, making a once brilliant and sharp woman believe she was truly useless. But the climax of the tragedy was not his coldness, but the arrival of the other woman. Eleanor's voice broke as she mentioned the name, Tiffany, the beloved daughter of a powerful general, a young, arrogant woman who possessed everything Ethan craved, power and connections. Eleanor recounted how she had found their text messages not flirtatious whispers, but cold, hard calculations. Ethan told his mistress he was sick of his provincial wife, that he was just looking for a good excuse to kick her out without tarnishing his reputation as a model husband. He needed Tiffany as a ladder to a higher rank, and Eleanor was the stone in his path that had to be kicked away. The truth was so brutal that Julian felt a sharp pain in his own chest. His hand unconsciously tightened on the arm of the sofa, blue veins standing out, betraying the fury raging beneath his calm exterior. He was enraged not only by Ethan's treachery, but also at himself for allowing the woman he cherished to endure such degradation for so many years. Julian stood and walked to the window, staring out into the black night. His back was to her, a solitary but solid silhouette. "Has he signed the papers?" he asked without turning, his voice laced with a cold, deadly edge. Eleanor shook her head, fresh tears welling up. "He didn't give me any papers. He just threw us out. He wants me to file, to admit I'm not worthy, so he can maintain his pristine image." A humorless, contemptuous smirk played on Julian's lips. In his mind, a plan began to form, as intricate and sharp as a master's chess game. He took out his phone and sent a short text to his most trusted assistant. "Investigate Major Ethan Carter's entire record for the past 5 years. Focus on illicit income and his relationship with the Reed family. I want the report before sunrise." Putting the phone away, Julian turned back, his expression now gentle. He walked over and placed a hand lightly on Eleanor's shoulder. Its warmth seeped through the thin silk, a rare anchor of peace for her turbulent soul. "You did nothing wrong, Eleanor," he said, his voice a deep, resonant comfort. "Your only mistake was giving a pearl to a blind man. But this game isn't over. He wants a reputation? I'll make him famous. He wants power? I'll show him what real power is." Julian's words were like an electric current, jolting Eleanor's dormant pride awake. She looked up at him and saw in his eyes a firm commitment, not the empty promise of a charmer, but the vow of a true gentleman. Eleanor excused herself to the bathroom. Standing before the large, brightly lit mirror, she stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror had swollen eyes and pale skin. She looked pathetic. But deep within those eyes, she saw a flicker of the old Eleanor Vance, the top student of the economics department, the woman who had captivated countless young men not just with her beauty, but with her intellect and spirit. She turned on the tap and splashed cold water on her face, scrubbing hard as if to wash away the filth, the weakness, the miserable submission of the past 7 years. She remembered Ethan's condescending gaze, the arrogant smirk on Tiffany's face in the photos she'd seen. They thought she was a weak, clinging vine. They thought that because she had no apparent family, she could be trampled on at will. They were wrong. She had been silent for too long, sacrificed too much, to the point they had forgotten that she, too, had claws, that the proud blood of a great family flowed through her veins. Eleanor lifted her head. The water droplets clinging to her lashes were no longer tears. They sparkled like sharp crystal shards. She dried her face with a towel, her movements newly decisive. Looking herself straight in the eye, she whispered, "The Eleanor of yesterday is dead. Starting tomorrow, the world will see me differently." She straightened her clothes, smoothed her hair, and walked out of the bathroom. Her steps were no longer the unsteady, trembling gait of a woman lost in the storm, but firm, light, and full of power. That night, in Julian Morgan's villa, a silent alliance was forged. The cracks in Eleanor's marriage finally shattered, not to collapse, but to let the light of truth and justice shine through, illuminating the dawn of retribution and rebirth. The morning sun after the storm seemed brighter than usual. Golden rays pierced through the leaves, drying the last of the puddles on the vast concrete grounds of the military base. The atmosphere was unusually lively, with the sound of bugles, the rhythmic stomp of boots on pavement, and the resounding call of drill commands creating a powerful martial symphony. In his private office, Major Ethan Carter stood before a mirror, adjusting the collar of his immaculate uniform, his face glowing with a barely concealed satisfaction. After expelling Eleanor and his daughter, he had slept soundly, the dreamless sleep of a man who had cast off a heavy burden. He envisioned a brilliant future. The vacant lieutenant colonel position, the backing of Tiffany's influential family, and glamorous parties free from the presence of his dowdy provincial wife. He sipped a strong coffee, its initial bitterness quickly giving way to a sweet aftertaste, much like his life now. He was sure that Eleanor, that weak woman with no money, power, or family, was probably now huddled in a bus station or some slum, weeping with regret. The thought made him smirk the smile of a victor. But his smugness was short-lived. At precisely 0800 hours, as Ethan was chatting with junior officers near the main gate about the upcoming promotions, an unusual event brought all conversation to a halt. From a distance, a sleek black sedan approached, its presence as majestic and intimidating as a great beast. It wasn't a military vehicle, nor was it the typical mid-range car driven by civil servants. It was a limited edition Maybach. Its polished paint reflected the dazzling sunlight, the proud double M logo on its hood exuding an overwhelming aura of power. The car glided silently through the gate, the low, potent growl of its V12 engine like the breathing of a dragon, before coming to a stop in the center of the parade ground, the prime spot usually reserved for the commanding general's vehicle. The entire area fell silent. Every eye, from the gate guards to the commanding officers, was fixed on this mysterious, uninvited guest. Ethan narrowed his eyes, a cold unease creeping up his spine. Who would have the audacity to drive such a car straight onto a military installation and park so brazenly? The rear door opened. A bodyguard in a black suit stepped out and swiftly opened the door for his principal, his movements precise and professional. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. From the opulent interior, a black, pointed-toe stiletto heel touched the ground. The sharp click of the heel on the concrete echoed in the silence. Then, a woman emerged. No one could believe their eyes, least of all Ethan Carter. The coffee cup in his hand nearly slipped. It was Eleanor, but not the disheveled, red-eyed Eleanor in worn-out pajamas from the night before. The woman standing before him was so radiant and alien he thought he was hallucinating. She wore a custom-made pantsuit that clung to her slender yet powerful frame, with an elegant ivory blazer draped over her shoulders, accentuating her flawless porcelain skin. Her long hair was swept up in a neat bun, revealing a proud, graceful neck. Her tear-stained eyes were now hidden behind fashionable sunglasses, but the aura she exuded was as cold and sharp as a newly drawn sword. Beside her, Julian Morgan emerged from the other side, the picture of a powerful, composed magnate. He said nothing, merely standing close to Eleanor, a steadfast fortress protecting his queen. Their combined presence created a dazzling halo that completely overshadowed the stern military environment. Whispers erupted like a disturbed hornet's nest. "Isn't that Major Carter's wife? Why does she look so different? Who is that man with her? He looks familiar. I think he's Julian Morgan, the CEO of Morgan Industries. That's no stay-at-home mom like Carter always complained about." The gossip was like needles in Ethan's ears. He was frozen to the spot, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Why was she here? Where did she get that car, those clothes? What was she doing with that man? Was this revenge? An attempt to humiliate him? Rage flared, clouding his judgment. He was about to storm over, to use his authority as a husband and an officer to berate her, to throw this shameless woman out. But before he could move, another sight nailed his feet to the ground. From the command building, Colonel Matthews, the base commander known for his stern and unapproachable demeanor, strode out hastily. Instead of his usual scowl at seeing unauthorized civilians, his face was wreathed in a broad smile. He walked briskly toward the luxury car, passing right by Ethan without so much as a glance, as if he were invisible. He stopped in front of Eleanor, and the most devastating blow to Ethan's ego occurred. The powerful colonel, the man Ethan had to constantly flatter and appease, bent slightly at the waist and extended both hands to shake Eleanor's, an attitude of profound and rare respect. "Miss Vance, what an honor. It's been too long since you visited. Is your father doing well?" Colonel Matthews' voice was loud enough for Ethan and the other officers to hear every word clearly. Eleanor removed her sunglasses. Her calm, dark eyes swept over the crowd before landing on Ethan's face, now drained of all color. She smiled a soft, civil smile, but her eyes were ice. "Thank you for your concern, Colonel," she replied, her voice clear and confident, carrying the undertones of someone in a superior position. "My father mentions you often. I was in the area for a business matter with Mr. Morgan and thought I'd stop by with a small gift, and also to take care of some personal business." The words personal business were spoken softly but landed on Ethan's head with the weight of 1,000 pounds. Julian then stepped forward to shake the colonel's hand. The two powerful men exchanged pleasantries, but Julian's eyes occasionally flicked toward Ethan, full of unspoken meaning, the look of a lion observing a sewer rat. Ethan stood there, feeling as if he'd been stripped naked in public. He, a major who took such pride in his rank, was suddenly small and pathetic before the aura of the wife he'd scorned. He was stunned to see Colonel Matthews, the man he fawned over daily, being so deferential to his wife. Who was the father the colonel mentioned? What was Eleanor's background that it commanded such respect from his superior? Fragments of the past rushed back. Eleanor's silence when he boasted, her never complaining about money, her occasional sharp insights into politics, which he'd dismissed with, "What do women know?" It wasn't that she knew nothing. It was that she was above his petty games. She had hidden her phoenix wings to play the part of a docile sparrow in the small cage he had built. Eleanor turned to look at him. The distance between them was only a few yards, but it felt like a universe. He saw no hatred or pain in her eyes, only a chilling indifference. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, a speck of dust. That gaze was the most painful slap, more potent than any curse. It stripped him of all the value and arrogance he had so carefully constructed. He wanted to call out her name, but his throat was tight with a bitter lump. He realized the woman standing there, beside the supercar and the powerful men, was no longer his wife. She belonged to a world that his greed and petty schemes could never touch. Eleanor turned and followed Colonel Matthews and Julian into the VIP reception hall. Her straight, proud back was seared into Ethan's retina. The clicking of her heels hammered the rhythm of his downfall into his mind. He was left standing alone under the sun, surrounded by the speculative, mocking stares of his colleagues. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt fear, not the fear of losing his position, but the fear of a man who has just realized he has kicked a hornet's nest, and the fire was about to consume the very ground he stood on. For Ethan, this bright morning was the beginning of a long, dark night. The VIP room of the tea house, tucked away in a quiet alley, was so silent you could hear the soft whistle of boiling water and the rustle of bamboo leaves outside the window. For Ethan Carter, however, this tranquility was the prelude to a death sentence. He sat across from Eleanor, the exquisitely carved mahogany chair feeling as if it were lined with thorns. In stark contrast to his agitation, Eleanor sat with her back ramrod straight, her slender hands gracefully preparing the tea, each movement a work of art. Placing a fragrant cup of green tea before Ethan, she said nothing, merely nodding toward the man in the black suit beside her. It was Mr. Davis, a shark in the city's legal circles, known for financially ruining his opponents. More importantly, he was on retainer for Morgan Industries. Mr. Davis slid a thick file across the table. The sound of the stiff paper scraping against the wood was like a knife against Ethan's frayed nerves. Ethan's hand trembled as he opened the file. The more he read, the paler his face became. This wasn't a simple, amicable divorce settlement. This was an indictment. Page after page detailed the assets they had accumulated over 7 years. Terrifyingly, the secret funds he had used to buy gifts for Tiffany, the murky transfers to secure his promotion, even the luxury condo he had secretly bought in his name for his love nest, it was all there, documented down to the last dollar and transaction date. "Did you think you held all the cards, Ethan?" Eleanor's voice, soft but icy, cut through his chaotic thoughts. "You seem to forget who managed this family's finances for 7 years. You forget where the seed money for your side businesses came from." Ethan was speechless. He had been too arrogant, thinking Eleanor was just a clueless housewife. He never imagined she had been quietly gathering evidence. But what made a cold sweat break out on his back wasn't just the division of assets. The final pages contained proof of his violation of military regulations, abuse of his position, and illicit relationships that damaged the unit's reputation. If this file were sent to his superiors or leaked to the press, his career, let alone his dreams of promotion, would vanish in an instant. What do you want?" Ethan hissed, his hand crushing the file. He wanted to tear it to shreds, but he knew this was just a copy. "Full custody of our daughter, the house as compensation for emotional damages. You will leave with exactly what you had when we married, nothing but your old pickup truck." Eleanor's terms were swift and non-negotiable. Ethan laughed, a bitter, twisted sound. He started to stand, to use his old bullying tactics, but the sharp glare from Mr. Davis and the sight of a bodyguard outside the door made him freeze. Above all, the name Morgan Industries and the image of Julian Morgan loomed over him like a mountain. He was facing a power he could not challenge. Eleanor wasn't screaming or making a scene. She was using the law, evidence, and soft power to slowly tighten a noose around his neck. Leaving the tea house, Ethan drove in a panic. He needed an anchor, a life raft. The only one he could think of was Tiffany. He sped to her apartment, hoping for comfort, or at least a promise to have her father intervene. But reality is often cruel. As he walked in, before he could even speak, Tiffany hurled a designer handbag at him. The socialite was furious about the rumors swirling among the elite. "What the hell did you do to have people saying you're about to be court-martialed? My father just called and tore me to shreds for associating with a man with a stained record." Tiffany shrieked, her pretty face contorted with rage. She didn't care about his fear or exhaustion, only her own reputation. Ethan stood frozen. He looked at the woman he had worshipped, the one he considered his launchpad. It turned out that without the promising officer label, he was just an inconvenience. He tried to explain, to plead with her to speak to her father, but all he received was a look of disgust and a threat to break up if he didn't clean up his mess. He was trapped. Returning to his office late that afternoon, the atmosphere on the base was thick with tension. The looks from his colleagues were no longer admiring, but speculative and filled with whispers. The phone on his desk rang shrilly. It was the administration office, coldly informing him that several projects under his command were being suspended pending an investigation. He dropped the receiver, slumping into his chair. So, Julian had made his move. The man didn't need to appear or raise his voice. A single gesture was enough to slam every door of opportunity in Ethan's face. He looked out the window at the graying dusk and remembered Eleanor's calm, superior demeanor that morning. He remembered the hot meals she used to cook, the nights she stayed up with their sick child so he could rest. He had shattered his own life for a fleeting illusion. Now, as the illusion faded, he felt the profound chill of being utterly alone. Meanwhile, at the Sunrise Villa, Eleanor was helping her daughter with her homework. The room was warm, filled with the child's cheerful laughter. Julian sat nearby, swirling a glass of red wine, watching them with boundless affection. He had just received a text from the lawyer. Ethan was showing signs of panic and making mistakes. He smiled. He didn't need to fight. He just needed to hand Eleanor the sword of justice and let her sever the ties to her past. In this game of wits, Ethan never stood a chance. He fought for greed. She fought for her life and her honor. And most importantly, Eleanor was no longer alone. The lawyer's office was suffocatingly tense. Ethan Carter sat there, his hands clenched, knuckles white, his eyes shot with the red veins of sleeplessness and rage. Though cornered by irrefutable evidence, a final delusion persisted in his ambitious mind, that underneath it all, Eleanor was still the weak, rootless woman he had sheltered for 7 years. He looked at her, so unnervingly calm, and let out a sarcastic barb, a last-ditch effort to reclaim his masculine pride. "You think latching onto that billionaire makes you someone? Eleanor, don't forget you're an orphan. The very roof over your head was because of my hard work. Without me, what are you? A doll, on Julian Morgan's display shelf." Eleanor didn't reply immediately. She set her teacup down, the crisp sound of porcelain on glass echoing in the room. Her gaze, no longer that of a submissive wife, was as deep and vast as an ocean before a hurricane. A faint, tragic smile touched her lips. She gestured for the lawyer to leave them. It was time to lower the final curtain. "You constantly called me poor, a burden holding you back," she began, her quiet voice resonating with a strange power. "But Ethan, did you ever wonder where the capital for your first side project 7 years ago came from? Did you ever ask why a young officer with no connections like you kept getting favored with investments from major corporations?" Ethan frowned, confusion creeping into his mind. That was my talent, my networking." Eleanor laughed, a sound laced with sorrow. From her purse, she produced an old, leather-bound passbook and tossed it on the table. It fell open, revealing transaction records from 7 years prior. Ethan picked it up. His eyes widened as he saw the name on the source account, Eleanor Vance, beneficiary of the Vance Family Trust. The name Vance struck Ethan like a lightning bolt. In the upper echelons of society and business, everyone knew of the Vance family of New England, a discreet, blue-blooded dynasty that controlled vast, unseen economic arteries. And Eleanor, the orphan wife he had so often belittled, was their sole, cherished daughter, the crown jewel of the entire clan. "I wasn't Cinderella waiting for a prince, Ethan," Eleanor said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the pain of the past. "I was a phoenix. But because I loved you, I broke my own wings and wore the feathers of a common sparrow to fit into the small cage you called home." The past flooded back. She spoke of defying her parents, giving up a life of luxury to follow a poor army officer. She remembered secretly selling heirlooms worth a fortune just to put better food on the table or to anonymously pay her mother-in-law's medical bills under the guise of Ethan's bonus. She remembered shivering through cold winters in a worn sweater when her bank account could have bought the entire street. She hid her identity not to deceive, but to protect his fragile ego. But her great, silent sacrifice had become the knife that stabbed her in the heart. "You looked down on me for having no family, so you ran to Tiffany, the daughter of some nouveau riche general." Eleanor stared at him, her gaze sharp as a razor. "Did you know that the real estate project Tiffany helped you secure was ultimately approved by my uncle's corporation? And the funniest part?" She paused, packing all her contempt into the next sentence. "The money you embezzled from our family funds to buy a house and car for your mistress. Did you think you earned that? No, Ethan. That was money I secretly deposited every month from my own trust fund dividends. You used your wife's money to support your mistress, and then you had the audacity to call your wife a leech." The truth, raw and devastating, was laid bare. Ethan was frozen. The passbook fell from his trembling hands. The floor seemed to crumble beneath him. What had he done? He had thrown away a flawless diamond to pick up a gaudy roadside pebble. He had scorned the woman who could have given him an empire for a fling, who offered only petty, short-term gains. His own stupidity and greed had made him the greatest fool in the tragedy of his own life. "You have eyes, but you are blind," Eleanor whispered, a single tear she had held back for so long, finally tracing a path down her cheek. It was a tear to bid farewell to a foolish past. "I used to believe that with enough sincerity, even a stone could be made to blossom. But I forgot that some people are fundamentally mud, and you can never build a castle on a swamp." Ethan wanted to fall to his knees, to beg, to scream that he was wrong, but his throat was paralyzed. He looked at Eleanor, now radiating a noble, unattainable grace. He realized the gap between them was never about money, but about character. She had humbled herself to love him, and he had trampled on that dignity. Now that the phoenix had awakened and soared, he was just a pile of ashes left on the ground. Eleanor stood, her posture regal and inviolable. She walked past him without a backward glance, as if stepping over a piece of wreckage from her memory. Outside, Julian was waiting. He hadn't heard the conversation, but seeing Ethan's ashen face through the glass, he knew Eleanor had claimed her justice. He opened the car door for her, shielding her from the late-season wind. In the silent room, Ethan Carter sat alone amidst the scattered papers. He buried his head in his hands, a wild, maniacal laugh erupting from his hollow chest. He laughed at his own colossal foolishness, at the exorbitant price of his betrayal, at the cruel irony of fate. He had lost everything, not because someone took it, but because he himself had set fire to the treasure in his own home to chase a mirage on the horizon. The tragic symphony for a traitor had only just begun, its most painful, resonant movement. The air in the penthouse suite of the Morgan Tower was so still you could hear the wind howling outside the thick, reinforced glass. Ethan Carter sat hunched in an expensive leather armchair, his once pristine uniform now rumpled, his tie loosened like a noose removed from a condemned man's neck. Opposite him, Eleanor sat with the serene composure of an undisturbed lake, dressed in a simple black velvet dress, a string of white pearls, her mother's only legacy, at her throat. Beside her, Julian Morgan swirled a glass of blood-red wine, his silent, towering presence pressing down on Ethan, making it hard to breathe. "Eleanor," Ethan began, his voice hoarse and broken, trying to feign the tone of the model husband he once pretended to be. "I know you're angry, and I know I was wrong, but think about our daughter, about Lily. Do you really want her to grow up in a broken home, to be pitied for not having a father? Think of the 7 years we had, the vows we took. I just had a moment of weakness. I was tempted." He was playing his final card, her compassion, the very weapon he had used to control her for years. He believed that no matter how strong a woman was, she would soften at the mention of her child and their shared history. But Eleanor was unmoved. A faint, cold smile touched her lips. She set her teacup down with a sharp click, cutting off his pathetic monologue. "Our vows?" She repeated the words slowly, as if they were poison. Are you talking about the vow that had you throwing your wife and child into a storm? Or the one where you used my savings to buy handbags for your mistress? I swear, I never meant for it to go that far, Ethan pleaded, his face flushed. I was drunk. I was angry. Tiffany pushed me. Enough! Eleanor cut him off, her voice quiet but absolute. Her slender hand pushed a thick stack of documents across the table. You say you were tempted. Then explain these. Ethan's hands shook as he picked them up. It was an investigation file, chillingly detailed. The first pages were photos of him and Tiffany on his business trips to five-star resorts, the dates perfectly matching the times his daughter was in the hospital with a fever and he had claimed to be in training. But the next pages were the fatal blow: bank records of illegal kickbacks, falsified invoices he had signed to embezzle funds from his unit, and worst of all, proof that he had secretly transferred ownership of their condo, the only major asset in his name, to Tiffany. His mask of the honorable officer, the devoted husband, shattered completely. You didn't just betray our marriage, Ethan. Julian spoke for the first time, his voice calm, but his words sharp as a scalpel. You betrayed your oath as a soldier. With this level of embezzlement, if this goes to the military prosecutor, how many years do you think you'll get? 10? 20? Life? The file slipped from Ethan's grasp. He collapsed to his knees on the cold marble floor, his arrogance replaced by pure, primal fear. Eleanor, you're trying to destroy me, to kill me, he whimpered. We were married. How can you send me to prison? Do you want our daughter to have a criminal for a father? Eleanor rose and stood before him, a goddess of justice passing judgment. I'm not destroying you, Ethan. Your own greed and depravity destroyed you, she said, her voice like ice. You ask if I have a heart? When you threw our daughter's clothes into the rain, did you have a heart? My daughter would rather have no father than a hypocrite who uses betrayal as a stepping stone. She took a deep breath. I'm giving you two choices. 1. You sign the divorce papers, relinquish all parental rights, and voluntarily resign from the army before this breaks. 2. We meet in a military court, and you will lose not only your wife and child, but your freedom as well. Ethan looked at Julian, then back at Eleanor, who held his life in her hands. He knew he had lost. His trembling hand picked up the pen and signed the divorce papers, signing away his life as he knew it. As Eleanor took the signed document, she felt not triumph, but a hollow relief. She turned and walked away, never looking back at the man who was now sobbing, a child stripped of his favorite toy. Julian paused by Ethan. Congratulations on your freedom to pursue your ambitions, he said, his voice laced with contempt. But remember, a lamp that burns on someone else's oil will eventually extinguish itself in darkness. The door closed, sealing Ethan Carter in the cold room with his desolation. Outside, the sky was clearing, a sign of a new beginning for the woman who had just walked out of the darkest chapter of her life. The disciplinary verdict was read with the finality of a hammer striking a coffin nail: stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, forced resignation. Ethan Carter stood numbly as he removed his uniform for the last time. The heavy iron gate of the base screeched shut behind him, forever separating him from the world he had sacrificed everything to conquer. In a final, desperate act, he went to Tiffany. The door was opened, not with a warm embrace, but with a suitcase containing his belongings thrown at his feet. "What are you doing here? Trying to drag me down with you?" She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "I needed a man with power, not a disgraced criminal drowning in debt. You're useless to me now. Get lost." The door slammed in his face. He had traded his wife for this, and now he was being discarded in the exact same way. The irony was devastating. Aimless, he found himself back at his old house. It now belonged to Eleanor. He saw a familiar car pull up. Eleanor got out, along with Julian and his daughter Lily. Upon seeing her father, the little girl flinched and hid behind Julian. The sight was a dagger to Ethan's heart. In his own daughter's eyes, he was now a monster. Eleanor approached him, her gaze filled not with hate, but with a vast, weary pity for a pathetic failure. "I've had your personal things packed," she said, her voice neutral. "They're by the side of the house. Please leave the key on the table. For Lily's sake, don't show your face here again. Let her have some good memories of the father you used to be." He stumbled away with his meager belongings, a few old uniforms, some books, and a wedding photo with cracked glass. He had once had it all: a loving family, a devoted wife, a beautiful child, and a promising career. His greed had burned it all to the ground. He looked back one last time. Eleanor was standing under the setting sun, bathed in a warm glow he could never again touch. She was looking toward the house, where Julian and Lily were waiting. The happy family that should have been his now belonged to the man who knew the value of the jewel he had thrown away. "Take care," Eleanor murmured to the wind, a farewell to a ghost of the past. Ethan Carter walked away, his long shadow twisted and lonely on the pavement. The gate closed behind him, this time forever. His sentence wasn't prison. It was a life of regret, forced to watch the happiness he once owned blossom in another's hands. That was the most brutal life sentence of all. 2 years passed. In the penthouse office of the Green Sprout Foundation, Eleanor Vance looked out over the city. She was no longer the timid housewife, nor the vengeful woman from the divorce. She was poised, elegant, and at peace, having found healing by dedicating her life and family's resources to helping thousands. The door opened and Julian walked in, placing a pot of white orchids on her desk. His gaze was filled with gentle pride. "It's time to pick up Lily," he said, his warm voice a familiar comfort. They drove to the international school, their comfortable silence a testament to an understanding built through hardship. Lily ran out, cheering Uncle Julian, and leaped into his arms, chattering about her day. He swung her up, his love for the child evident in his eyes. The picture of their new family was seamless and filled with genuine joy. That evening, they sat on the porch of Eleanor's new home, a house she had bought with her own money. A gentle autumn rain began to fall, soft and quiet, unlike the violent storm of 2 years ago. The memory of that night still sent a faint chill through her, but it was now a distant scar, not a bleeding wound. A warm hand covered hers. It was Julian's. He knew what the rain reminded her of, and he was there to ensure she would never be cold again. "Eleanor," he began, his voice sincere, "I waited for you in college. I waited for you through a difficult marriage. I've waited for you to heal. Waiting for you has never been a burden, because I always knew you were my destination." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. This man had pulled her from the abyss, patiently rebuilding her shattered faith. He didn't make grand promises. He simply stood by her, a steadfast shield against the storms. "I thought I could never trust in love again," she confessed. "But you taught me that love isn't about possession. It's about the peace you feel when you're together." He squeezed her hand. "The past is over. The people who didn't deserve you are gone. Now, it's just you, me, and our future. I can't promise a life without storms, but I promise this hand will never let go." There was no grand proposal, no diamond ring. There were only 2 souls, finding each other after a long and painful journey. Eleanor smiled, her first truly, completely happy smile in years, and rested her head on his shoulder. Outside, the rain fell. No longer a lament but a gentle love song, washing away the last of the old dust and leaving a clear sky for tomorrow. They sat hand in hand, watching the rain, their silent presence the perfect answer to all of life's questions. Their love was not a fiery passion, but a deep-rooted, resilient tree, stronger for having weathered the storm. The story of Eleanor's rebirth was complete, a testament to the fact that after the rain, the sun will always shine, and somewhere, a heart worthy of yours is waiting to offer healing and love.